Hello, and welcome to Tokyo Inklings. My name is CY, and you can find me on Instagram at Tokyo Station Pens.
My name is Jacob, and you will find me on Instagram at Foodafan, and I have a blog at foodafan.com.
Welcome to episode 2. Jacob, how are you doing?
I'm good. It's an interesting time for sure, but despite everything that is happening, I do have some new pens and some paper, so I'm happy.
Right, and we'll talk about this later as well, but Japan has just declared a state of emergency last Tuesday. A bit behind the rest of the world. Not exactly ideal, but, life goes on. But what are you writing with? What are you using right now?
So I'm writing with a pilot pen that I will talk more about later. It's inked up with a Lennon toolbar ink called Wenshan Puchong Tea, and I'm sure I'm messing up that pronunciation. But I've really become a fan of this Taiwanese brand Lennon toolbar. They have beautiful colors, usually these more desaturated pastel colored inks, and a bit similar to Kyoto Tag, but the difference I would say is that Lennon toolbar inks tend to be more wet, so they work better in my pens.
I got that for you from Hong Kong, didn't I?
You did that, and the reason, yes, that's true from like Muse pens. And the reason for that is that Lennon toolbar inks, just like Taiwanese stationery in general, is just inexplicably expensive in Japan. I'm not quite sure what the reason is, but it's like 1/3 of the price almost, or at least less than half the price in Hong Kong and Taiwan.
Yeah, I wonder what kind of distributors they're using, because it seems like a lot of the overseas brands. I mean, obviously it makes sense if you're importing something for it to be a bit more expensive, but we're seeing that the Lennon toolbars are what? Something like 3,000 yen? That's $30?
Right, it's one of the more expensive inks here in Japan. It's more expensive than most sailor inks. It's more than almost twice the price of Pilot Iroshizuku and so on.
Right. So that confuses me, because Lennon toolbar inks, they weren't that expensive in Hong Kong, but reasonably assuming we're still importing into Hong Kong from Taiwan, since it's a different customs area. So I don't know. The distributors, especially it seems, of Taiwanese products, are really raising the price. And obviously distributors have to make a living somehow, and without them we wouldn't be able to introduce these products into the market. But the markup is quite significant. Then you said you had a second pen.
My second pen is a Chinese pen, a Pen BBS 492, their magnet filler, the Year of the Rat special edition, and it's inked up with a Maruzen ink called Marine Blue, which we'll talk a bit more about later.
Jacob, when did you order this pen?
So actually I ordered 2 of them. So first, a bit of background. This pen was released earlier this year for Chinese New Year, and initially it was only available on Taobao, which is this Chinese domestic Amazon equivalent sort of. And we had some friends who were kind enough to order it on Taobao for me and to ship it first to Hong Kong, and then it was meant to be sent from Hong Kong to Japan. But because of a virus and more, it's still stuck in Hong Kong. But recently Pen BBS added this pen to their Etsy store, so I bought a second one from their Etsy store, and this is the one I'm writing with today.
So shipping from China seems to be resuming more or less, not exactly speedy, but at least the stuff gets there.
So it's a bit consistent. I've had 2 deliveries from China that were very fast, unusually fast. Then I'm waiting for 2 others that seem to be stuck somewhere in China with some kind of security failure, and maybe they had to be resent.
Right. And maybe this is a good opportunity, because you were, I believe, expecting to receive your first magnet filler at the Maruzen Pen Show.
Yes.
So let's talk a bit about the pen show and why you weren't able to receive that.
Right, yes. So Maruzen had its annual pen show in March. They've done this now for 10 or 11 years, I believe. And
Yep.
so this is a pretty big event, and they always have their own limited edition pens, limited edition inks, and they invite um, shops like Eurobox and Eboeta to show off the products and so on. So, and they also have workshops. So it's a fairly big event, and we have some friends in Hong Kong and Taiwan and elsewhere who were meant to come to the pen show, but of course this year is very special because of the virus situation. So not only were most of the events, like workshops, they were cancelled, but it was dangerous or difficult to fly to Japan. So all of our friends who were meant to come from overseas, they had to cancel their trips. So that's why I don't have my first magnet filler, and that's why the pen show was a bit different this year.
Right. And on top of the cancellations, this was in the first week of March, where things hadn't gotten that bad around the world yet. I remember we had Paperlate from Slack come to Japan just a week before, and I was supposed to receive my 1950s Mont Blanc 146 muled to me kindly by Hungry Nerd from Slack as well. But obviously that got canceled, and everybody started canceling, and including the event organizers and including a lot of the booths. So it seemed like the awareness for the virus was there among retailers even before the state of emergency. So as a result, how would you classify the traffic, compared to previous years?
I remember last year I wanted to buy all of their 10 limited edition show exclusive inks, and I lined up, before the show opened, and I was maybe, the 20th or 30th person in the queue, and all the inks were, sold out fairly quickly. This time I went there in the afternoon, and I think all of the inks were still available, and I only saw a few people in the shop, so that was very unusual.
Right, but then I went a few hours later, and all of the inks that I wanted to get were all gone.
Yes, I think what happened is that people didn't, take time off work to go there, but the people who got off work at, around 5 or 6 o'clock, they stopped by Maruzen and got their inks. So by the time you went there, it was too late.
Right. And we talked a bit about Maruzen in the previous episode, but Maruzen is quite special. So as far as I am aware, Maruzen is closely associated with fountain pens because they were the first retailer in Japan to offer fountain pens. And they imported initially the first fountain pens in Japan were Onoto pens from the UK. And so Maruzen was importing these pens, and then eventually they developed an in-house brand called Athena, which would mimic these Onoto pens. So that's why a lot of for example, the Streamline or the anniversary editions that Pilot's making for them, they all look very similar to vintage Onotos. And Maruzen used to be a very important spot for, let's say, writers. And one particular writer who wrote the book Lemon, um, Motojiro, Kaji Motojiro, he was well known to frequent Maruzen. And so that's why Maruzen is associated then with lemon. And so they have all these lemon themed merchandise at Maruzen. So Maruzen is actually, now if you go to Maruzen, it's quite a small fountain pen space, but in terms of the fountain pen history and the significance of Maruzen, it's actually quite important. And that's why they have this World Fair every year to celebrate celebrate their significance, their importance in the fountain pen world in Japan. And I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, it is, and it continues to be a major event here. The pen community is always looking forward to the annual Maruzen event, and you have people who always buy their annual limited edition pens.
Yeah. And actually, you went there just the evening, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I went there in the afternoon, and all inks were still available as far as I could tell. What you couldn't find were some of the show exclusive pens, and the reason for that was that they had taken pre-orders this year, and some of the pens sold out before the event even started. So for example, there was a blue custom Urushi that sold out quickly. Uh, but I did have, for example, Time Traveler, which is this Sailor Prophet 21 or 1911L in Micarta, which is really just a smaller version of last year's 150th anniversary pen, the Sailor King of Pen Micarta called Voyage. And by the way, this Voyage pen came with an ink called Marine Blue, which is a slightly greener version of Eternal Blue, I would say. And this year they started selling the Marine Blue ink separately.
Right. And moving on then to the inks, I have a complaint, Jacob. I have a complaint about their inks. You've heard my complaint already, but my complaint is their merchandising. So, you know, Maruzen inks, they're quite nice. Especially, I would say, some of the later years, they became really, 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 really nice. Um, and, you always hear these stories of, I went to Maruzen, lined up for 4 hours, and I couldn't get the ink that I wanted. I don't think that should be the business model. And I know that a lot of people talk about rarity and scarcity. I think as a retailer, when you stock products, you have this world fair. And by the way, the Maruzen event lasts more than a week, so it's about 9 days. It's inconceivable to me that you have a series of products that consistently sells out in the first few hours, not even the first few days, the first few hours of your 9-day event. You need to order more products. You need to have more of these products because, I mean, let's face it, if they were really playing the I can't say this word today, exclusivity game, then don't re-release these inks. But if you're going to re-release these inks, make them available to people who come to your event. I mean, if it sells out in the middle of the event or at the end of the event, yeah. But I went there this year. What is it? At 7 o'clock, so maybe 9 hours into the event, and they were sold out with no international traffic, maybe half of the local traffic. How is this possible? Who's making the merchandising decisions in Maruzen? For me, this is really, really grinds my gears that the retailers like Itoya, I mean, Itoya is much better. This year's Ink was very well stocked, but particularly Maruzen, Kobayashi, Bungukan, really just grinds my gears. And that's my rant.
Right, that's definitely true. I'm just wondering if they're sometimes struggling to estimate demand. So inks, I definitely agree. But you also see that with the pens. We talked about how some of the show exclusive pens sold out before the show even started, giving people less of a reason to go to the show. I wonder if that is really what they wanted or if it was miscalculated demand.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit more difficult for pens, but come on, guys, you've been doing this for 10 years. Maruzen, get your stuff together.
Another interesting thing they did this year is that they had not just one but 3 new inks. So they announced they're going to have a new ink called Kinkan. So this, golden yellow ink. But when we went to the event, we saw not one but 3 new inks: so Kinkan, Ginkan, and Dokan. So silver, gold, and bronze, right? And the Ginkan was the real hit, I believe, the one that sold out faster. So do you want to talk about the Ginkan ink and what made it special?
So they had Kinkan, Ginkan, and Dokan. So I think that's going to be quite difficult for our listeners to differentiate. Kinkan is the gold ink. Kin means gold. Ginkan is their silver ink, and Dokan means their bronze ink. And um, it's quite interesting because they really pushed Kinkan before the sales event, and they had all the swabs ready to go. And we actually went to Maruzen a few weeks before the show and had them show us these swabs. And it was an ink, wasn't particularly exciting or anything, but it was an ink. It was an exclusive ink. We were gonna get it, fine. Then on the day, as you said, they came out with Ginkan and Dokan, and wow, Ginkan is cool. It's like a Sailor 123 with color shifting, um, multi-chromatic properties. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jacob. It goes from gray to pinkish to like greenish and purple. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I would say the base color is gray, but then it has this green and purple undertones, depending on what paper you use. But with a paper that shades well, you definitely see at least 3 colors.
Yeah, and this ink coming in the vase bottles, this ink went fast. This ink was fortunately I was able to get my hands on a bottle, but I think there were like 3 or 4 bottles left by the time I was there. And it's really the one that hit it out of the park for me. It's special. I'll tell you why I like it, because it's unique. It's not a monocolor standard gray. I think grays are quite tricky because there's so many and so many good grays. So that's one. Second, it comes in a large bottle. So in terms of the cost performance, if you think about the price, it's a much better value proposition than the 123, which is, I think, one of the most popular grays right now. And three, it's quite legible. You can read, so it's a light, desaturated gray that you can read. That's interesting, and I think it's still something that you could. I mean, if you're signing legal documents, maybe black or blue is your standard bet. But if you're in an office environment, this is looks perfectly normal from afar. But then when you look deeply into the ink, it has a lot of surprising depth, and that's what I really love about inks. Um, and then the last one, Dokkan, it's I think a bit of the lost child of the three inks, don't you think?
Yeah, so from the name, it sounds like it would be some kind of bronze copper color, but it's almost like a salmon pink.
Yeah, it's this salmony, pinkish orange underhue ink, and I believe it sheens a bit silver, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that
But
for
very,
sure.
very small, very small.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those were the three inks. But other than the inks, I went there even, a few days later, on the weekend, for some of the pen events. And although most of them were closed, some of them actually were still open. Before we get into the main topic of Shishikura, I want to talk about this company. It was called Hirai. So they're not really I would say, pen manufacturer. They work with wood, and they use, it says on the website, they use the traditional methods of the rokuro
Ah, yeah.
to cut wood and antler I think it's must be deer antler into pens and other like knives, blade handles, and stuff like this. Then maybe we can move on to our main topic about shishikura.
So there's this company in Japan like Sunrise Trading,
Yes.
and they sell important cell pens, but they also have a pen doctor, Shishikura-san. So I think maybe we talked about her before. She travels around Japan and does pen clinics, and she also sells. She designs and sells these limited edition sailor pens that are some of the sparkliest sailor pens around. They are not cheap by any means, but they are incredibly sparkly. And she was at the Maruzen event, and she sold I think 2 or 3 new models, and I think you got some of them, right?
She sold two new models. So Shishikura um, is, as you say, a pen doctor, and a pen doctor is what you call, nib workers in Japan. So she's a pen doctor, and she came out with the Sirius series of sailors. Um, and her pens, as you say, are some of the most sparkly out there. This year I bought two of the pens. One of them is Yozakura, which is transparent pink on the top, on the cap, while being a shimmery kind of, I would say, a subtle blue, but with subtle. It's navy blue, but with the subtle specks of shimmer um, on the body, and then the finials are this kind of creamish color, and then the section is a metal section. So this was very interesting. The nib design is this beautiful sakura design with a moon and some traditional Japanese clouds on the nib, and I got two of these. These were requested from me by some members of Slack, so I got those for them. And then I got another one. I'm not quite sure what the name of this one is, but it's a transparent, again, sparkly sailor pen, fully transparent with milky white pearlescent finials. And this one also went to another member of Slack.
And the thing about Shishikura's pens is that if you want to buy them, you can't just go into a store. You have to look at her, pen clinic schedule and see where in Japan she is going to be and whether she will bring her pens, because sometimes she doesn't, right? So,
Yep.
so she travels around Japan and does these pen clinics usually at retail stores, department stores, sometimes at pen shows, and sometimes she brings her pens to sell. And so you need to time your trip to Japan if you're coming from overseas to
Yeah.
to coincide with those events. And
Yeah.
of course they do sell out fairly fast, even though they're quite expensive. So it can be a challenge to buy these Shishikura
Yeah.
pens.
So the clear one is called Shinra Bansho, and as you say, most of the pens are limited run of 50 pens. So you can imagine how rare these are, and you can only buy them in person, so that really adds to the rarity. And yeah, so I got two of these pens. I got some of her inks, which are now Tono Limit inks, which is quite interesting. But she's a very well respected pen doctor. I got three of these pens, obviously, and so two of the Yozakura and one of the Shinabansho. All three of them were in no, the Shinabansho and one of the Yozakura I got in Zoom, and I got the other Yozakura in B. And when I got there, it seems that most of the the bees were going out quicker, whereas the zooms, um, they stayed in stock. So I was fairly happy. I got to play with one of the nibs, and it's going to be shipped off to its new home soon. But these are stunning pens. And what's interesting about them is I think their metal sections. And so these pens run generally, I'd say if you're looking to export them out to the West, will run you about a bit over $500. And that's after all of the shipping and the various associated costs, about $500 to get it over to the US. So they're not cheap, but they are beautiful.
They are beautiful, yes. So while we are on the topic of recent acquisitions, have you, other than your Shishikura pens, have you gotten anything else?
Um, yeah, so I got two things actually. I don't think I shared with you, but I got two different things. They're not for me, but I got one pen from Pentanoto. Did I tell you about the Pentanoto?
I don't think you did. So tell me.
So I got their letters from Fukushima Sailor Rialo, and this is not for me. This is again for another person on Slack, but the pen is called Shinebagun no Akari, so the kind of the light of Shinebagun, and it's this uh, dark but translucent-ish blue pen. It's a Rialo, and I reground it into a broad oblique italic. And I really like these Rialo pens, these kind of translucent Rialo pens from Sailor. They're really, really quite nice. They're well balanced. It's the only piston filling pen from Sailor. And as you know, maybe our listeners are not aware yet, but I only use pens that aren't CNC, aren't cartridge converter pens. So these kind of pens are really, really great. And I think I might pick one up for myself.
But so, Pentanote, they have an online store now, right? So previously it was a
Yes.
bit difficult to buy from them. Maybe you could contact them via Instagram and so on. But now I think fairly recently they set up their own online store, and they might even, I'm not sure, do they ship internationally?
Now I'm looking at their website, and it doesn't seem like they ship overseas. So I just sent you a picture.
Ah, yes, this is the dark blue sparkly one. It is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, I might have to get one myself. So one last point that I want to make about this pen from Pentanoto is the naming. And we talked about how a lot of the retailers are still in the countryside, and they come out with some of the most interesting stuff in Japan. And it's quite interesting because I think a lot of the stores have a very strong and proud local identity. So the pen is called Shinabagun no Akari, and it was inspired by the earthquake that happened in Fukushima. So Pentanote is from Fukushima, and they come out with this whole series of Fukushima-inspired products. There's the letters from Fukushima. There's the ink series, um, and this Shinamagun no Akari. It means the pen. The name means the light of Sinabagun, and that's really to symbolize the strength that the Fukushima people feel, and to kind of give hope that even though there might be natural disasters, even though things might not always go pan out the way that we want, we do have light at the end of the tunnel, and I think that's quite beautiful, quite inspiring. And they have a whole line of products with this, and I think it's something that resonates with the Japanese audience. And I think now, with the situation that's going on now, it's quite apt, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if in the future we're gonna see some future models with names that relate to the struggle and overcoming the current struggles. So while we are on the subject of new acquisitions, I mentioned it briefly before, but I have been on Mercari. Yes, so we talked about Mercari last time, right? How this is this Japanese second-hand marketplace, and for people who don't know, when you start the Mercari app on your phone, you get a list. You see recent listings, and the listings are of course a function of what you have been searching for recently. So if you've been searching for fountain pens, and of course Mercari is going to show you recent fountain pen listings. And I started Mercari with the intention of selling something, but the first thing I saw was the listing number 4 listed just a few minutes ago was a Pilot Custom Urushi, and it was from a seller that I have bought from before, a seller that I trust, and the price was very good, and I had a bit of a Mercari balance because I had sold stuff recently. So yeah, I bought it. I bought it. So it was a fantastic price, and it's basically, as far as I can tell, it's like a new pen. There are no scratches whatsoever, and it writes. I love this pen. It writes beautifully. I like big pens, as you know. This is definitely a big pen.
It's a
It is
big
a
pen,
big pen.
yes.
It is almost, I mean, it is so big that you can't really, I mean, it has a clip, but it's kind of
Hmm.
pointless because you can't have this pen clipped to a shirt pocket. It looks ridiculous. And you can use it as a roll stopper, so I like the fact that I like the clip for that reason, but it's definitely not the pen you have in your shirt pocket, and it's even too long for most of my pen cases. So I'm not quite sure how to bring this one to work, if I even want to bring this to work, but it's so comfortable in hand, and this nib is pilot's size 30 there. It's a newly designed nib for this pen, and it has this soft touch. And I didn't, I had told myself that I didn't like soft nibs. I'm not sure if I was in denial or if I had changed my mind, but I like this nib.
But you've also told yourself that you don't like pilot pens.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know that there's this saying, strong opinions weakly held. You have a strong opinion about something, but you can easily be swayed in another direction, and this pen has
Mm.
swayed me in the other direction. I lost, and I love this pen, and that's what's so dangerous about Mercari. So as I think I mentioned last time, but the thing about Mercari is that it's not an auction, right? So people post something they want to sell, and the first person who presses the buy button gets it, right? So you see a new listing, especially if you see that it was posted like minutes or seconds ago. You know that not many people have looked at this yet, so you need to make a quick decision. Is this something I want to buy? Because if it's a good deal, then you probably need to buy it right there, right now.
You need to buy it right
Yes,
there, right
yes, and
now.
that is what's so dangerous about Mercari.
So now that we're in the state of emergency, how are pen acquisitions like in the age of COVID-19?
So I've been working from the office most of this week. I couldn't work from home, and I remember I went to Maruzen on a Wednesday after lunch, and that was after the state of emergency had been declared. But Maruzen was open as usual. Maybe the opening hours had been changed. Maybe there were slightly fewer people, but it was more or less business as usual. So you could buy whatever you wanted there. I think that's mostly the case, still the case today. I actually went to the website today, and some of their shops in Sendai and so on have been closed, but their big stores are still open, and I think that is true for many other shops too. That you can still go to the retail stores, and you can definitely buy what you want online. What you cannot necessarily do is buy from overseas, because we're starting to see shipping problems in both directions.
Yeah, and And ever since the state of emergency, and this is the thing with Japanese businesses, that they're waiting for the government to do something before they want to act. So they think, you know, safety of their employees and of their customers is kind of the responsibility of the government. And it's really, really interesting because um, the moment that the state of emergency was announced, and the moment after Koike, governor asked asked businesses or asked shoppers to stay at home for the weekend, what happened was that all of a sudden, all of the major department stores decided we're going to shut down our department stores and we're going to close for the weekend. Or then the state of emergency happened, and then they're now closed from April 9th all the way up to May 6th. But this is only possible because the government asked for the state of emergency. So what this means for retailers is that some big retailers, and maybe it's something that our listeners wouldn't have expected, but a lot of department stores carry a fountain pen section. So Isetan has some limited edition Twisbees, for example, and they have a bunch of other limited editions. They also sell private reserve via their ink bar, but so they're closed out until May 6th. And I checked their online store, and their online store is not open either. And we mentioned Kobayashi just now, and I know I didn't talk about Kobayashi because this was a post state of emergency acquisition for a friend. So I bought two of their Makie caplesses, the vanishing points. And usually they're not available unless you go to their store. But because of the state of emergency, because nobody can go out anymore, they've started to open up domestic shipping. So if you're in Japan, you can now buy from Kobayashi via Instagram. So that was also a bank transfer payment. Other than that, we have a lot of events now shifting online. Tono Limbs, we mentioned that they had some events on the last episode, but they were meant to do an event in Fukuoka a few weeks ago. And instead of outright canceling the event, they decided to move part of their event online. So they had these timed releases where you have to follow the Instagrams, follow the Twitter in order to know what's dropping and what's going to be available from who. So it's quite interesting because we have for the past 5 to 10 years we had the system in fashion of the timed drops, let's say, and now we're seeing the pen industry kind of adapting to the situation and also adopting this drop style event sales model.
One thing we have seen is that events that were scheduled for this month, they have been cancelled and replaced with online events. So, for example, we talked in the first episode, we talked about this paper show Kamihaku, and we talked about Tono and Lim's spring events. They have both been cancelled in the original form, and they have been replaced with what they call online events. And I think they're still trying to figure out what that format is meant to be, but as far as I can tell, it means two things right now. It means that they open up either on an online store or via an Instagram post. They say, hey, we have right now for today or this week this particular limited edition or this thing you can buy only right now. The other thing they do during this online event is that they invite creators like hand lettering artists to do online streaming on Instagram, for example, when they show how beautiful this new ink, this new Tono Limbs ink is. So, for example, someone like Beshori, they might invite him to do hand lettering with the latest and greatest Tono Limbs ink.
All right, so what are you doing now with your lockdown time? at home? What are you doing with your stationery?
I've been playing a bit with paper. So we talked in the first episode, or there was a question about what paper people use here in Japan, what is considered fountain pen friendly, and so on. And earlier this week, I found this memo pad from a company called Kamiteria, or Kamiteria in Japanese, and it was a paper sampler, so similar to that Yamamoto paper sampler, but instead of A4 sheets, it was just a small memo pad, like B7 size. And actually, they sold 3 versions of it. There was one for pencils, and was one for ballpoint pens, and one for fountain pens, and each had different papers. So the one that I got, the one for fountain pens, it had 5 different kinds of papers that were chosen to be because for their fountain friendliness, and it was OK Fools, and bank paper, and Tomoe River, what they call Tomoe River Techo, so that 52 GSM, the thinnest one. And then something called Spica Bond, which I'd never heard of before, and also something called Eastery COC, another one that I had at least never heard of. But what I found interesting, the most interesting thing about this product, this memo pad, was not so much the paper as in the description. So you got a little note that described each kind of paper and what made it fountain pen friendly. What are the properties of this paper? And it did not talk about shading at all. It did not talk about sheen. There were really 3 terms that were repeated over and over. One was kakeaji, so how nice is it to write on this paper? And then there's kyushusei, so how well does it absorb ink? And the third one is how well it how little ghosting or show through, bleed through you see, so uranuke. And when you read these descriptions, and going back to kakeaji, so to the feeling, it says, for example, for OK Fools, it says kari kari toshita natsukashi mukashi nagare no kakeaji. So they made it a selling point that it's not smooth, that it has this nostalgic toothiness to it. And also that they make it a point, they make it sound like a feature that it absorbs ink well. So it has, ink no subayai kyushusei. And it's the same for the other papers. So for the Spica Bond, it says, ink no suikomi ga batsugun. So they make it a selling point that this is absorbent paper. So for someone who, considers, say, Rhodia to be, fountain pen friendly, they would read this and think that this is, the polar opposite, right? So obviously, yeah, it's subjective, and I don't know if Kamiteria, wrote this themselves or if they copied and pasted marketing material. But to me, this is more or less consistent with what I've heard about people, how they describe, fountain pen friendliness in Japan. So not in terms of shading and sheen, but in terms of how well does it write and how absorbent is it. So is that consistent with what you've heard too?
I mean, are there words for shading and sheening? I mean, I know sheening here, it's called flash.
Red flash.
Yeah, red
Yes.
flash. So pink flash or whatever flash it is. But it's a very new and not everybody. It's a very new term. Not everybody uses it. I don't know what shading is.
It's true that there's no direct translation of a shading, but sometimes you see, this null refill paper. It talks about how vivid the ink looks on paper. What I found interesting about these papers is that was not mentioned as a feature here. It was more about how it felt to write, less about what ink looked like.
Yeah, and maybe shading is more considered a feature of the ink rather than the paper.
That may be true, but obviously even your sheen monster might not look as good on some papers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I'll get to that in a bit. But let's finish up. Let's continue with the commentary paper samples because you just talked about okay fools.
Yeah, so all of the descriptions were kind of similar, or 4 out of the 5 were similar in that they talked about how it was to write on it and how well it absorbed ink. The one standout was Tomoe River, where they talked about how even though it's very thin, you still don't have any bleed through. So that was the standout. And obviously that's also the property we're familiar with Tomoe River. So I played around with these papers myself, and I would say that Spica Bond and Eastery, they had the most texture. I actually really liked writing on both of these papers, but ink looked very dull on it. You had again, this goes back to shading. There was no shading whatsoever. It was just one tone, and it was not vivid at all. And then one level up from that was bank paper, where you did get a little bit of shading, and you still had a nice texture, and you had very little in terms of a bleed through. The one that I liked the most, I really like this OK Fools paper, because it had a bit of texture, not as much as the others, but it had a little bit of texture, which I think is nice because it helps you really, shape the characters. And it had surprisingly good shading, and at least with the pens I had inked up, I didn't see any bleed through and very little ghosting. But the big caveat here is that I only had my pen BBS inked up with this bent nib, which is kind of medium-ish. They call it fine, but it's more of a medium-ish nib. And then I had my Mont Blanc with, well, it doesn't say what it is, but it's sort of medium finish. Actually, this is the nib that you worked on for me. You fixed a hard start on that nib. So it's not, it's kind of finish. It's quite wet because of the ebonite feed, but it's still relatively fine. So maybe if you're using, a double broad or music, maybe some of these papers will fall apart, and maybe that's when you will see, the bleed through resistance of Tomoe River versus the others more clearly. But at least with these nibs, I would say I was surprised by how nice OK Fools behaved. So I might go get some OK Fools notebooks now.
I've been at home. Honestly, I write less now that I'm at home. Um, but I've been trying this vintage onion skin paper. So, according to one of our good friends, it used to be very common as a typewriter paper, but it takes fountain pen ink quite well. It doesn't bleed through, but it shows through. There's no feathering, and like the bank paper and the speak up on that you were talking about, it makes the ink look a bit more dull. So the same ink on Tomoe River will shade like crazy, but on this onion skin paper, it just gets absorbed into the paper and looks a bit more flat. I've noticed that it can sheen a bit, but certainly not as much. And so I have a bunch of this onion skin paper that when I went to Kyoto, I made into a vintage kimono book, this journal. So now I have this B5 sized journal with a bunch of onion skin paper in it. And I am planning on making a kind of like a ink collection, ink catalog in this notebook, which now seems a bit weird because now that I've tested the paper, it's not exactly something that shows off the properties very well. But that's what I've been doing. So I've been practicing getting ready for it. Practicing some of my calligraphy, trying to plan out how I want to do this notebook. Another thing that I've been doing is that recently I went over to a friend's house who lives maybe 20 minutes away from me by foot. So we've just been walking here, no transportation for us. Um, we went over and I did a small little workshop exercise with her, teaching her the basic strokes of kanji. And so that was a very fun time out there. We had some cheese fondue, and we wrote a lot of kanji. And maybe in a future episode we can get her on the show. Her house is amazing. It's a stationery store in the house. It's incredible. And because of her, Jacob, I bought a typewriter. So been playing with my Olivetti Lettera 32 for a while these past few days. But yeah, that's what I've been doing at home.
And she, of course, she is one of Shishikura's biggest fans, and she also very knowledgeable about these pens. So yeah, we should definitely get her on the show. That would be very interesting.
Yeah, she's very, very good, and she knows a lot.
She knows a lot for sure. Yes. Should we move on to questions? Do we have any new questions or unanswered questions?
Yeah, we have some new questions, some unanswered questions. So let's see. So Nemodos asks, how common is it for people to take their everyday pens to get work done? For example, a nib grind or a barrel slash nib fitting.
So what I would say about that is that it's reasonably popular to get ink flow adjustment done. So people go to these retail store events with a pen that they have received or bought, and it doesn't write as well as they like. So they want to make it more wet. They want to remove some toothiness, or maybe the other way around. It's not, they don't go and say, can you make this a stub? They are saying, can you solve this particular problem with a nib to make it more or less wet? I think this whole idea of getting a nib grind is relatively new here, or at least very, very niche. What would you say?
I absolutely agree with you. I think a lot of Japanese consumers are obsessed with this is how it came from the factory kind of usage, and there's a big fear of changing the nib. So nib grinds, as in regrind into, say, italic or whatever weird and funky shapes you have. It's very rare, and the grinders will do it, but they also have some hesitation. So one of our friends, she took the platinum Noka SM to be ground into an italic, and Mr. Mori from Wagner said, "Oh no, not Mr. Mori. Yeah, Mr. Mori said, yeah, you're ruining the nib." So a lot of grinders themselves have a bit of hesitation in doing that. So you need to know who to look for, and somebody that you've worked with quite a while. Not everybody is willing to accept that kind of work yet. Somebody that is very willing is Nagahara. He, I think, is more prolific in changing the profile of the nib. You do have, however, people grinding for nib reduction just slightly. So that is something that happens, but very rarely changing the shape.
Yeah, right. And you mentioned Nagahara there, and he is obviously one of the best, if not the best person in the industry. And he offers 4 different levels of nib services. And the first level does not even involve any kind of nib grinds. So the first level is just ink flow adjustments. You pay him, I think, 3,000 yen to get your nib to flow, to be wetter or drier. But then you mentioned something interesting, which I agree with, is that some of the nib grinders here, heard about Kawaguchi in particular, they are quite opinionated about what you as a customer should and should not be doing, right? So he might be saying that, no, that is not a good idea. And then you also have people who call themselves and who are pen doctors but don't even offer grinds. So pen doctors to them means I will fix the ink flow for you, but I will not turn your broad into a cursive italic.
Yeah, especially pilots, pen doctors.
Yes.
So that's all for today. Thank you. Again, Jacob, do you have any shout outs that you want to make?
Sure. So I would shout out to our friend Alessa. She has this YouTube channel at Inky Rocks, and she does the most hilarious and amazing pen and ink reviews. I would call her the Michael Bay of
Michael Bay of pen reviewers. That she is, the Michael Bay of pen reviewers. I agree. Anyone else you want to shout out?
There are a few podcasts I always enjoy. One is the Nib section, and another one is Fountain Pen Companion.
Yeah, and I will shout out to the Pen Addict. Thank you so much for talking about us on your last episode. We really, really appreciate it. It's always incredible to hear. We just made one episode, and it's great to hear such positive feedback. Shout out to all of you, the listeners. We have had an incredible response to the podcast. I mean, we weren't expecting so much for episode 1, but we have almost 300 downloads. So that's all thanks to you guys. Shout out to everybody who submitted questions. Your questions make the podcast more interesting. And then finally, a really big shout out to all the content creators out there who are making our lives a bit more interesting at this time, all for free. Shout out to all of the retailers who are modernizing and moving to an online style retail experience that helps us continue with this hobby and with this passion while we are unable to go outside. Thank you very much. This has been Tokyo Inklings, episode 2. My name is CY, and you can find me on Instagram at Tokyo Station Pens. That's Tokyo Station Pens on Instagram.
And my name is Jacob, and you will find me on Instagram at Foodafan, and I have a blog at foodafan.com.
All right. Then without further ado, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.